In this video, we're going to be listening for events in JavaScript. That is, clicks, change, input, those types of things, and then we're going to be able to run functions based on those events. So let's get going. Okay, so in this video, what we're going to be doing is diving into events within the browser. Now, events are how you interact with the DOM, and while this is going to be impossible to do a full-on deep dive into events, we're going to be talking more or less about how you can have events that are registered so that you can interact with the DOM and at least get started in what you'll need for the rest of this series. So we have a folder called events here that has an index.js that's empty, as well as an index.html file. In fact, let's open up both of these and close the sidebar here. And then if you're following along in this course, you can go ahead and select Events 101, and you'll see here what we have. We have a Click Me button that does nothing. We have a number input that, well, it increments in numbers when you hit up or down, or you can change it. And we have a text input without a label. Not a very accessible text input, but we're not about accessibility in this course right now. We're just talking straight up events, okay? So what do we want to accomplish here? Well, we want to accomplish some events within the Click Me. We want to be able to listen to events on the input boxes, and we want to be able to really work with JavaScript in a way that is framework-less, as in you're not using a React, a Vue, a Svelte, any of that stuff, but is still interacting and updating the DOM. So let's go ahead and get started with our Click Me button. As many of these videos are going to do, we're going to be starting with a const click_me, and this is going to be from our last video, document get element by ID click me. Now, just about throughout the course of this entire series, we'll be using IDs attached to things. So if you ever see me do a get element by ID, you can assume that unless we're showing it on camera, that click me is going to be existing on the element that we're talking about. So what we want to be doing here is when you click on this Click Me button, that we're just going to simply console log out. Hey, this thing has been clicked, okay? So let's go ahead and add an event listener. So an event listener is what it sounds like. It's something that listens for an event and then outputs a function or runs a function. So if we wanted to have a function being run, we could determine a function here that would be clicked. Okay, this function is just called clicked, and all it's going to do is console log the word clicked. Now, if we want to add an event listener to this click button, you can say click_me, which is referring to the HTML element that we've gotten right here, click me dot add event listener. Now, add event listener takes two parameters that we care about right now, one of which is going to be the event. The event is going to be a string, and this string is going to be click. At least that's what we're using. So when you click something. And the second parameter is going to be the function that is run. So in this case, the clicked function. So now anytime you click this button, you should see clicked. And you can see it only outputs once, but then you'll see the number increases over here for just how many times this has been clicked. We click this 20 times, it will say clicked 21 or click 20. Click 21 because I clicked it 21 times, right? So as you can see here, we have told this, here's a function to run, here's a thing to do. We listen for the click, and then we run this function. Now, throughout the course of this series and through basically the rest of this, to avoid creating a bunch of functions like this and then referencing them, what we're going to be doing is working with a lot of inline arrow functions to do this same thing. So if we were to duplicate this function here, or the add event listener, click_me, add event listener, and then instead of passing a function into here, we were to put an arrow function in here just like this, we can now console log click directly from this, and we can console log this out like so. And this is essentially, for all intents and purposes in this course, going to be the same thing. As in, when you click this each time, you can see it outputs clicked the exact same way. So while this is referencing a function that we're creating, this is creating the function inside of the event listener the exact same way, it's just slightly different. Okay, so this is a good start here. Let's go ahead, and now what we want to do is now we want to work with this input. Perhaps every time we click this button, maybe we want to increment the value of this input. So the first thing we're going to have to find is the const click underscore value, which you can see is listed right here, click value. And we're going to say document dot get element by ID click value. Now this is a input type of number with a default value of 0. You might think that this would lead to the value when we read this element of being 0. But let's actually go ahead and do a quick experiment before we implement something about the event listener here. The quick experiment that we're going to be doing is to simply check the type of the click value. So if we console.log a type of click underscore value dot value, you might think this is going to be a number, considering this is a number input. But if you'll notice here, what's output is actually string, because anytime we're working with a number input, of course, it's going to come in as a string. So which means that if we want to increment this thing, what we'll want to do is we'll want to always convert it to a number. Now there's a lot of ways to convert things to numbers, but an easy one is to use a function baked into JavaScript called parseInt, which will turn this thing into an int. Now an int is a non-decimal number, so this isn't going to work if you want to do something like 0.1. But this will work with 1, 2, 3, 4, right? A non-decimal number. So what we can say is let value equal to, and we're initially going to, instead of just setting this to 0, what we're going to do is grab the initial value directly from the input itself. That way, if we update it in the HTML, that's kind of the single starting point of truth. Meaning that if we say parse int click value dot value, we should now see the value if we log this out. And keep in mind, we're going to be doing a lot of console logging in this course. You can watch me do it, or you can do it yourself if you want to see the values. But again, at the end of the day, what we're doing here is largely just experimenting before we get into building actual things, okay? So what we have here is we now have a 0 being output as not a string, but a number. You can tell that it's not a string because, well, it's like a green color. It's a different color, right? So, cool. We have our value now set to be a value. Next thing we'll want to do is we'll want to update that value. So we can say value is plus equal 1, and now that value is going to be equal to a number greater than what it previously was each time we click it, and it's going to update this each time we click it. You can see this being output directly if we just console log this value directly afterwards, saying click me, and what you should see, value 1, value 2, value 3, value 4, value 5. Each time we click it, it's taking this one value that we set and it's incrementing it by 1. Now let's say we want to then pass in that value back into our input. Well, this is actually pretty simple. All we need to do is say click value dot value, because we're accessing the HTML element and then its property of value and setting it equal to the new value. Okay, we can remove this console log and we can remove this other one that says clicked, because what you should see now is you should see that whenever we click this, the input is going to increment by 1, just like that. So this is fantastic. We're now able to take a value from an HTML input, update it, wait for it and update it on the click of something else, and then re-put it back into the input. Cool, right? Very cool. Okay, so let's keep moving here, and what we're going to be doing now is adding an event listener to the change me, because we're going to be listening to a different type of event, and we're going to be talking about events on inputs. Again, this video is largely set up to give you some core skills in dealing with inputs. So what we'll want to do next is grab a new DOM element, const change me, which is again right here. And this is going to be document get element by ID change me. Now change me is just a very simple text input. Now we have access to change me in a very simple DOM element called change underscore me. So change me, we can add all kinds of event listeners. Now you can add as many event listeners as you want for different types of events. You can say add event listener, and you can listen for a change event like this. And a change event, you might think, fires whenever the value is changed. However, if we were to run this, and we're going to be doing this again largely through console logs, you might run this and you might expect if I type in here for change to be fired each time I type, but it isn't. Actually, in fact, it only toggles if I've changed the value and I'm selecting off of it. So the moment I blur off of the input, you can see change me fired. If I focus and then blur off of it, it doesn't refire. But if I focus and remove one and then focus off, it fires. Cool, right? So next one we're going to take a look at is going to be the blur event. Now, blur is going to be an event that fires whenever you tab off of the element. Sorry, I wrote blue, but it's blur. That would be fun, right? Okay, so here you can see that, let me say blur, and let me change this one that says change me to change, okay? Just so we can keep track of them. So you focus and then blur. You can see blur run, but change didn't run. Now we changed this, we blur, and you can see change runs first and then blur runs after. All right, so that's the blur event. And now we have more events. Even further, we have things like input. Now, input is going to be the event that fires whenever you make a modification to the input itself. As in, if we type in here, every single time we type, it's giving us the latest value. F, 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 right? So this is a really nice way to listen for each new character that's being typed into an input. So to add some comments here, this fires, a change event fires on blur before blur only if value changed. Blur fires on focus off, okay? And then input fires on individual character change. Now there's another kind of interesting input that fires on individual character change as well that could be used to make modifications to the values, but it doesn't get support in Internet Explorer. So if those of you out there who still have to use Internet Explorer, this one's off the table for you. But believe it or not, there's also a before input event. Now before input functions slightly differently than input, where if we were to type in here, you're going to see that before input fires immediately, but then input fires. But the difference is that the change me value when before input fires gives us an empty string, as in it fires with the value in the value as what it was before the change happens, where the input gives us the F, which is the character that's been inputted. So if you're looking and you ever see input and before input, that's really the big difference. The only difference in usage of these things is that before input itself does not work again in Internet Explorer, which honestly, I'm over supporting at this point. Okay, so now there's a couple more things you need to know about events before we move on. One of which is that the event function that fires gives us an event parameter passed in to this function. As in, if we say event as a parameter here, we have access to the event itself. So now when I type, and keep in mind I'm on the input and not the before input, just to keep things not confusing here, you'll see that whenever I type, it's not just giving us information about the DOM element, it's giving us a ton of information about the event itself. This event has all sorts of properties, things like bubbles, which we'll talk about in just a second. Data, which is the data being passed in, right? If I were to say S, the data is now going to be S, but the value is much longer than S. So the data you can see here is S, but the value is this whole string. We also have something called default prevented. Now, prevent default prevents a function from propagating further, which is a little out of the course of this series, although we may be using it once or twice, and I'll explain why when we do. However, if we continue to scroll down, you can see there's a lot of things in this event, one of which is the target itself. Now the target gives you access to the DOM element. And you may have used this in your front-end framework work if you've ever done so, because you can utilize things like event.target.value to get the same value that we have as change_me_value, because event.target allows us to access, again, the entire DOM node properties from the DOM node that we've had the event on. We're going to be using this in a kind of interesting way as we go. Now, okay, one more thing is going to be about bubbling. I'm going to add one more event here, and it's going to be so on the card that wraps around everything. We have this class of card. So we're going to first grab that using const, and we're going to say card. And this time we're going to say document.query selector, and we're going to say dot card to get the card. There's only one of them. So we're not using query selector all, just query selector card. And that gives us our card, which will say card dot add event listener click, and then we're going to run an inline function from this. Now you might be also wondering about all of the different wonderful events that take place in the browser. Well, there's a lot of stuff, and you're going to need to really dive into the documentation if you're looking for a specific type of event. Usually it kind of helps to know what event you're listening for. I'm listening for something with the keyboard, something with the mouse. I'm listening for a focus, a blur, those types of things, right? But it's, again, something that will come with experience. I've also linked to the HTML input events spec here, which will show you just a brief example of all of the different input events, right? And that's just for input elements in themselves. Okay, so we have a card add event listener with a click on it. And we'll once again want to take advantage of having the event inside of here. And what's neat about this is that we'll want to take a look at something specifically. I'm going to say console.log, and we're going to say event.target to see when I have a card here and we click anywhere in this white space, it gives us the div of the card. But if I have this button here and the button is a child of the card, what happens, do you think, if I click this button? If I click this, you can see the button itself becomes output. Now you might be thinking, well, that's just what we had up top here, but you'll know we removed the console log from here. So this button is no longer console logging whenever we click it, meaning that this console log, as you can see from even the note here, right here, it says it came from line 44 in our index.js, meaning this console log right here, hey, it says, hey, I thought I had an event listener to the card, not the button, right? But then when you click the button, it says, hey, I clicked. So this is actually something called event bubbling, where when you click the card, the event bubbles up, right? So the click does not just take place on the card here, it's taking place on the button and moving upwards. And if we want to see that entire pathwards upwards, we can actually do so using event.composedPath, which is kind of a newer function. I don't believe this has full browser support, but if we click this, you can see the bubbling path here, and you can see if we open this up, the button was then clicked. Now the button is a child of the card, which is a child of the body, which is a child of the HTML, and which is a child of the HTML document, which is a child of window. Kind of neat, right? And this gives you a little bit of an insight into how the browser works. Okay, so here we go. We have a whole bunch of different event listeners, a bunch of different event types, and this is a small percentage of the events that exist within the browser. This by no means is meant to be an entire comprehensive on the events of the browser, but what we've shown here is that you can interact with DOM elements directly by attaching an event listener to an individual element, and then utilize things like just straight up JavaScript where we're incrementing a value and then setting that value back into something else. Okay, again, just a core skill that we're going to want to have before we get moving on some of the cool APIs that exist in the browser. So the next one that we're going to be doing is talking about the creating DOM elements in the browser. Creating DOM elements in the browser is not something that a lot of people do when they are getting started with JavaScript. But once you do, you realize that you can interact and create things and move around the DOM with your own creations of elements in all sorts of ways based on data that's coming in. And you can do a whole lot with straight up vanilla JavaScript in this regard. So as always, this is Scott with Level Up Tutorials. In the next video, like I said, we're going to be talking all about creating and appending HTML elements via JavaScript.